On a stormy spring night, deep in the Sierra woods near a forgotten town called North Fork, a grieving mother opened her cabin door and met a legend. She didn't find a monster. She found a child, soaked in rain, trembling with fear. Its eyes weren't wild. They were human, as if it remembered what love felt like. That night, she didn't shut the door, and neither did her heart. What began as a knock in the dark became the bond that healed two souls across worlds. But how far can kindness echo? How far can a story like this travel? From a lonely cabin in the woods to wherever you are right now. Dear listener, what's your name? And where in the world are you watching from? Maybe, just maybe, this tale found you for a reason. If your heart beat a little stronger, if you believe in quiet magic and second chances, help us grow a place where the misunderstood are seen. Like, subscribe, and welcome to our circle, a home for every soul who ever hoped Bigfoot was real and kind. She could feel the storm in her knees before it ever reached North Fork. The ache always came first, dull and deep, where the old bones whispered warnings. Marion Tate, 54 years old and long since done hoping for surprises, sat hunched over her son's broken rocking chair, the one she kept promising herself she'd fix. Her fingers worked the sandpaper in steady strokes along the curved armrest, smoothing over the splintered edge like it was something sacred. The fire in the hearth gave off more smoke than warmth tonight, flickering against the knotty pine walls. Outside, the wind howled low and hungry through the trees like it was searching for something it had lost. The roof creaked. The tin awning above the porch chattered like loose teeth. Rain fell in thick, slanted sheets, drumming a steady beat overhead. That chair had belonged to her boy, the one she'd buried 20 years ago in spring. He would have been 30 now, tall and broad like his father, maybe working out in Boise or fishing off the coast like he'd once dreamed. She didn't let herself go too far down that path. Not tonight. Not when the storm had a voice of its own, and grief already curled beneath her ribs like a sleeping dog. She set the chair leg down and leaned back. Thunder cracked, so close it shook the windows. The lights flickered, then steadied. Just before they dimmed again, she caught her reflection in the glass. Worn. Alone. A woman who knew too well what silence could do to a soul. Then it came. Thump. ... Thump. She froze. Not the kind of noise that came from a branch or a shifting shutter. It had a rhythm, a pattern. Her ears, attuned to the forest in every season, caught something off. The knock was low, not at chest height, like a visitor, but much lower, around the level of her knees. Marion stood slowly, her joints stiff from hours hunched over the chair. She crossed the floor in socked feet, her breath catching with every step. She flipped on the porch light. Nothing. The peephole gave her only rain and shadows. No movement, no silhouette. Still, she waited. The wind screamed through the pines. The knock didn't come again. She told herself it was probably a limb caught in the siding, or maybe the old maple had lost another branch. But her hand lingered on the knob, like it remembered something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. A memory. Faint, like the echo of a dream. She turned away, then it came again. Thump. ... Thump. Lower this time, quieter, almost tentative. The breath left her chest. A chill traced up her spine, not from the cold, but from the feeling that whatever stood beyond the door knew exactly where she was. The sound didn't beg. It didn't demand. It asked. Against better judgment, she cracked the door, just an inch. A thin slice of warm light fell onto the porch. And there, half hidden in shadow, barely the size of a toddler, stood something soaked to the skin, covered in matted brown fur. It was trembling. Arms curled around itself like it was trying to hold in its own warmth. Its eyes were the first thing she noticed, round, black, wide. Not like a raccoon's or a bear cub's. Not animal. not human either. But there was something in them, something ancient and scared. Her first instinct screamed to close the door. Her mind grasped for logic. Maybe it was a sick animal, a malformed cub, something feral. But her heart remembered. Years ago, a little boy with damp hair and muddy boots had knocked just like that when he was locked out after sneaking off past curfew. 3 quick knocks, 1 soft. He had invented it, he said, so she'd know it was him. Her hand fell from the door. The creature, no, the child, made no move to enter. It didn't growl, didn't lunge, just stared, shivering so hard its tiny shoulders shook. She grabbed the old flannel from the hook, the one with the missing button, stepped back inside, set a bowl of milk on the floor near the fire, next to a folded wool towel. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, just opened the door wider, enough to let the warmth reach the threshold. It watched her for a long moment, then took 1 slow step forward. Inside, the fire crackled louder than usual. Rain drummed the roof. The creature knelt at the hearth but didn't touch the milk. Instead, it did something that made Marion's skin tighten. It placed 2 fingers gently on the wooden floor, then tilted its head, not toward the bowl, but toward her, as if it were feeling the vibration of her heart, as if it needed to know who she was. Only after that did it drink, 1 sip, then another. She didn't move, just knelt at a distance, watching it from across the room. It didn't speak, didn't make any sound, but something about its breathing, about the cautious way it curled near the edge of the rug, told her this wasn't the first time it had hidden from something worse than a storm. The wind rose again. A new gust screamed through the trees. Then, a loud, splintering crack outside. Marion's head snapped toward the sound. A branch. Big. Close. She was moving before she could think. The porch. The thing was still outside the door. She flung it open, just as a massive limb crashed down, smashing the railing where the creature had stood minutes ago. The impact rattled the porch boards. She rushed into the rain, heart hammering, bare feet slipping, grabbed the little body and yanked it into her arms. It was cold, soaked through, light as a dog, but dense with fur, inside again. She slammed the door shut with her back. Her breath came in short bursts. The thing didn't resist. It curled into her arms like a child who had nothing left to lose. She laid it on a blanket by the fire. It didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, it reached for the towel and wrapped itself. Thunder rolled again. The storm wasn't done. She looked at it. This strange, small being who had knocked on her door like it remembered how, who had looked into her face and waited before it drank, who had nearly died under a fallen limb and didn't even flinch when she pulled it from the rain. Something broke inside her, something quiet. She watched it curl up, exhausted by the hearth, eyes fluttering shut. She whispered to the storm beyond the window. No one's scary when they're cold and alone like this. Outside, the wind went on howling. But inside, the rocking chair creaked just once, like someone had finally come home. The rain had passed in the night, leaving behind a silence too fragile to trust, the kind that settles after something's broken. Marion stood barefoot by the window, holding her coffee close, staring out at the dripping edge of the roof. Each drop fell like a metronome, soft and even, into the puddle below the porch, reminding her that the storm, no matter how loud, always ran out of ways to scream. She hadn't slept much, not with that little creature curled by the hearth like some forgotten part of her had come home. And yet, come morning, the ache in her joints was quieter. There was something about waking to the soft rise and fall of another being's breath that softened the sharp edges of being alone. He was still there. She didn't know what she expected, really. That it had vanished into the woods before dawn. That she'd dreamed the whole thing up. Some leftover ghost of grief pretending to be a child with eyes too deep for its size. But no, he was there, wrapped in her old towel, 1 foot poking out, the fur on his back still damp in places where the fire hadn't reached. and his chest. Tiny, rising and falling with a rhythm so calm, it nearly broke her. Marion moved slow, careful not to startle him. She placed a bowl on the kitchen counter, smashed a handful of ripe blackberries from the freezer, leftovers from last July, into a ceramic dish, mashed them with a spoon until the juice pooled rich and purple, steamed a handful of spinach from her garden stash, warmed milk just shy of boiling, everything quiet, measured. She didn't know what he could eat, but she figured a creature brave enough to knock on her door could decide for himself what was safe. When she turned, he was awake, not startled, just watching. Those black eyes, glassy but alert, tracked her every motion like he was still trying to decide what kind of creature she was. She knelt beside the hearth and placed the tray a few feet away, then backed up, palms open, careful not to crowd him. He sat up slowly. His fur had dried in thick patches overnight, and she saw now how fine it was, closer to down than hair, soft but tangled, like it hadn't ever known a comb. He reached for the dish with those strange, human-shaped hands, touched the rim like he was checking its warmth, then brought a smear of the blackberry mash to his lips. And then something happened. He closed his eyes, just for a second, but Marion saw it. That pause, the kind that lives between hunger and comfort, the kind of pause that comes when something tastes like safety. He tasted again, and this time, he didn't stop. Marion sat on the edge of the rocker, holding her breath, watching him eat in slow, careful bites. It wasn't greed. It was restraint. Politeness, like he'd been taught or had learned. Not to take more than needed. He noticed everything. The way the floor groaned beneath her as she shifted. The way the wind tapped once against the chimney flue. The way her eyes lingered on him too long. And when she reached up, just absently, as people do, to rub the back of her neck, he mirrored it, tilting his head, brushing his own fur with fingers that knew what mimicry meant. The house had never been so quiet. Time didn't tick forward the way it usually did when she was alone. It folded inward, like both of them had slipped into some place between past and present, where names didn't matter, where pain had weight, but not voice. He rose after he'd finished, slow and steady, and padded across the floor without a sound. Marion stayed seated. She didn't speak. Something told her words would only break it. He sniffed at the corner shelf near the window. Then, carefully, he reached out a hand and took something. Her heart stopped. The rattle. Wooden, hand-carved, soft from age and handling. It had been her son's. One of the last things he'd ever touched before. She didn't finish the thought. Barnaby. She'd started thinking of him as Barnaby without meaning to, the name floating up from somewhere in the night. Held the rattle between his fingers. Turned it. Gently shook it once. The sound it made wasn't loud. Just a soft clatter of wood against wood. But it cut straight through her. She stood before she knew she had. He froze, still holding it. She took one step forward, hands out. Not to snatch it away, just to touch the air between them. He looked at her. Those eyes, dark as river stones, blinked slowly. Then, with a movement that was deliberate and deeply unfamiliar, he placed the rattle down on the window ledge and turned his whole body to face her, and placed his hand, small, palm out, flat against his chest. Then he walked forward. Marion didn't move. Barnaby reached up, only halfway, as far as his little arms could stretch, and pressed that same hand to the center of her chest, over her heart. She gasped. Not from fear, from recognition. It wasn't a gesture she knew, but it carried meaning, a weight, a stillness, like a prayer or a vow. And in that moment, she understood. This was how they shared grief. He knew. Somehow, he knew what she had lost, and he was giving it back. Not the boy, not the years, but something older. The permission to feel it again. She closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not loud, not broken. Just quiet rivers over tired skin. When she opened them, he had stepped back. She wiped her face, took a breath that hurt. "You're not just a lost thing," she whispered. "You see." He blinked once, sat back on his haunches. That was all. Later, when the sun had climbed above the trees and the ground had softened from the storm, Marion stepped outside with a bucket to fetch water from the spring. Barnaby followed. Not close, not far, like a shadow that kept its distance out of respect. The trees shimmered from the rain. Birds chirped again. Life had returned, cautious but certain. She was halfway across the mossy stones near the bank when her boots slipped. It happened fast, too fast to brace. But just before her foot could twist and her body collapse into the shallow creek, a strong tug on the back of her coat yanked her upright. She landed hard on her heels, heart in her throat. Barnaby stood behind her, both hands still gripping the hem of her jacket, eyes wide, chest heaving. He hadn't hesitated. She dropped to a knee, caught between laughter and disbelief. "You little—" she breathed, chuckling through her tears. He let go. They stared at each other for a long while, the water rushing beside them, the sky broken open in light. That night, she sat beside the fire, that old rattle still on the ledge, untouched. Barnaby slept beside it, one arm curled beneath his head like a child who had finally let go of fear. And Marion, eyes on the dancing flames, whispered to the room, to the quiet, to something older than either of them. "Whoever you are, if you've got a heart, you know what it is to hurt." Outside, the world kept turning, but inside that cabin, two broken pieces had started to mend. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Just enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, the woods hadn't taken everything. Not forever. The forest had shifted. You could hear it in the way the wind moved, no longer sharp or restless, just slow, warm, like a sigh exhaled after holding its breath too long. Summer had come to North Fork in its quiet way. No grand entrance, just longer days, softer mornings, and the hum of cicadas tracing through the trees like a memory you couldn't quite name. Each morning, Marion walked. Not because her knees liked it. They didn't. But because Barnaby seemed to bloom out there, under the canopies where light came filtered and dappled, where the world didn't expect anything from either of them. He walked beside her, never ahead, never lagging, just a little to the left, as if that side had always been his place. The routine was simple. She'd pack a small cloth bag with bits of fruit, boiled eggs, a jar of peanut butter and honey. He didn't always eat what she brought, but he always watched. Watched how she opened things. Watched how she smelled for spoilage. Watched how she walked with intention, scanning for snakes, avoiding loose stones. He mirrored her habits, picked up on the smallest cues. It wasn't mimicry, it was learning. She saw that now. He wasn't just from the woods, he was of it. But he wasn't alone in there. There were mornings the forest felt aware, like the branches held their breath when they passed, like eyes blinked behind bark. Marion wasn't superstitious, but she'd lived long enough in that cabin to know when something was watching, and it wasn't always animals. One morning, not long after the blackberries started to ripen, they passed under an old cedar, one she'd walked by 100 times, and just as they stepped beneath it, a branch cracked high above. She froze. It was heavy, thick, should have landed square on her back, but it didn't. It landed 2 feet to her right. Clean fall, no ricochet, no bounce. She turned. Barnaby was staring at the shadowed woods behind them, head tilted just slightly, the way he did when something was speaking that she couldn't hear. Then, without a sound, he raised one hand, just lifted it to the trees and dropped it slowly, like a wave, like a signal. The forest went still after that. That night, Marion sat on the porch with her eyes on the treetops. She hadn't said anything, not aloud, but her mind had started stacking questions in neat, uneasy rows. Who was watching, and who exactly was keeping them safe? The answer didn't come from the trees. It came 2 days later, with the sound of boots on gravel and the voice of someone she hadn't seen in months. "Miss Tate?" She looked up, squinting at the sunlight. Reed Dawson stood at the edge of her path, hat in hand, jacket tied around his waist, eyes sharp but warm. 26, if she remembered right. Grew up on the east end of the valley. His mother used to trade fresh eggs for flour with Marion when she and Jack were first married. He nodded toward the woods behind her cabin. "You been noticing anything strange out here?" She didn't blink. Define strange. Reed stepped closer. His eyes scanned the porch, the windows, the woodpile. "I found prints," he said finally. "Near the river bend. Not bear, not cat. Something with toes." She raised a brow. "You think someone's walking around barefoot in this mess?" He hesitated, then pulled something from his back pocket. A photo. Grainy. Black and white. "I took this back when I was 12, he said. "Never showed anyone. Figured they'd laugh me out of town. But I was hiking the ridge near Stillwater and a rock slide came out of nowhere. I should have been crushed." Marion took the photo. It was blurred, the figure mid-motion, but tall, towering, shoulders like stone, and those eyes barely visible, but unmistakably watching. "I didn't fall," he said, "because something stepped in front of me, blocked the rocks, then disappeared." She didn't say anything. "I thought maybe I imagined it. But then last week, a couple of drunk hunters showed up at the ranger station. Said they saw a man with fur near Miller's Creek, bragging about setting traps." Marion's stomach turned. "They're calling it a wild man, laughing. But they've got snares and liquor and not much sense between 'em. I'm worried." Marion folded the photo carefully. "I think you should be." That night, Barnaby didn't sleep. He paced the floor, ears twitching, eyes flicking toward the window. Marion tried to coax him into rest, but he kept drawing shapes in the ash near the fireplace. Circles, lines, symbols she didn't understand. At first, she thought it was just a child's fidgeting. But then she stepped out early the next morning to gather eggs and found them. Rocks and sticks arranged in deliberate patterns along the edges of her yard. Low, hidden, like signals. Barnaby had built warnings. He led her down the southern trail after breakfast. Wouldn't let her take the usual path. Kept glancing back to make sure she followed. His feet made no sound. Hers broke every twig. And yet, even through the noise, she could feel the tension in the air. It coiled like wire. He stopped by a tree she didn't recognize, bent low, and pulled aside a pile of leaves. Underneath was a wire trap. New, set with bait. Her heart hammered. He reached for a stick and with practiced care, snapped the trigger without setting it off. Then looked up at her, eyes steady, serious. He shook his head. No, it wasn't safe anymore. They walked home in silence. The kind of silence that holds too much meaning to break. Marion felt the weight of it in her chest. The guilt, the fear. The knowledge that something she couldn't name was getting closer. That night, as she watched Barnaby curl beside the hearth, his small hand resting on the edge of the rug like he was listening through the floorboards, she whispered something she hadn't meant to say out loud. "You're protecting me too, aren't you?" He didn't move. Didn't need to, because she already knew. And out in the woods, beyond where firelight reached, something listened. Autumn slipped in like an old friend who didn't knock, just let themselves through the back door and sat quiet until you noticed the air had changed. The light turned softer, slower. Trees shed their greens for gold and blood red without apology. And Marion Tate, for the first time in 2 decades, found herself waiting for the woods to speak first. She didn't need a calendar to tell her summer had ended. Her hands felt it in the mornings. The chill lingered longer. The mist clung lower to the ground. But more than that, something had shifted in Barnaby. He moved differently. Not slower, if anything, his steps were more deliberate. He stayed close, but not as close. And he started to lead. At first, Marion thought it was just him getting bolder. Braver, maybe. But it wasn't that. He wasn't testing limits. He was inviting her. And that made all the difference. They left earlier now, before the sun fully cleared the ridge. past the blackberry brambles and up along the deer paths she'd always avoided. The places she'd never dared to go, not because of fear, but out of respect. There were parts of the forest that felt old enough to deserve silence, and yet now they opened up to her. He led her across a ridge blanketed in cinnamon-colored ferns, through a break in the rocks slick with moss. Beyond that was a clearing she'd never seen, a shallow spring with water so cold and clear it looked like it hadn't touched the air in 1,000 years. There was a stillness there that felt chosen. She knelt by the edge, dipped her fingers into the water. It stung her skin with its purity. Barnaby crouched beside her, reached down, and plucked something from the bank. Mushrooms, a cluster of them, pale and round. He turned one over, then another, separating them with care. He held one up, then the other. Same shape, same color, but he set one aside and placed the other in her hand. Then he pointed. She looked closer. A hairline crack ran through the cap of the discarded one, barely visible. A rot that hadn't yet spread. It wasn't chance. He was showing her how to see. Later that same day, after they'd shared slices of roasted squash by the fire, he rummaged through the basket beside the porch and pulled out a small pile of leaves. They weren't fresh. He must have gathered them over days. Red ones, mostly. Some still wet from dew, others crisp at the edges. He sorted through them with quiet concentration. Then, carefully, picked one. It was perfect. No tears, no holes. Deep burgundy, shaped like a flame. He walked to her, cradling it in both hands like it was something sacred, and offered it. Not handed it, offered it. 2 palms outstretched, arms bent low, head slightly bowed. Marion didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt it. This wasn't just a leaf. It was permission, a right, a signal. She accepted it with both hands, mirroring his posture. Something passed between them in that moment. Not language, something older, something rooted in trust, and the kind of knowing that comes without proof. The next morning she heard it, a sound too low for human throats. Long, drawn out. It vibrated the floorboards under her boots. Not a growl, not a roar. A call, deep, measured, carried through the trees like it had been sung for generations. Marion stood on the porch, her hand on the door frame. She knew that sound. Not in the way one knows the bark of a dog or the cry of a hawk. She knew it in her bones. The same way her son had known which knocks would bring her running. The same way grief could fill a room just by stepping into it. Barnaby was already awake. Standing by the edge of the porch, eyes to the tree line. He didn't move, didn't flinch. But his breathing had changed. Something was out there. Something, not him. Later that afternoon, as the clouds moved in and the wind turned sharp, she lost sight of him. It was her fault. She'd gotten distracted, caught up in tracking a bird she didn't recognize. A flick of russet feathers through the trees. Just for a second. But when she turned back, he was gone. She called for him, softly at first, then louder. Nothing. The woods had changed again. Shadows longer, sound thinner. Every direction looked the same. She turned once, twice, heart climbing, breath shortening. She hadn't been lost in decades. And now, in the same woods she'd walked her whole life, she was spinning. She leaned against a tree to steady herself. That's when she heard it. Not footsteps, not a voice. A tone, like a whistle made by the earth itself. One note, then silence. Then another, slightly higher. She turned. The sound wasn't random. It was guiding her. Each note echoing off the trees in a pattern that formed a path. She followed. Branches gave way. Light shifted. A narrow opening appeared where none had been before, and standing at the edge of it was Barnaby. Still, waiting. He walked her back without a sound. That night by the fire, she couldn't stop looking at him. "Someone called to you," she said. He didn't nod. Didn't need to. She understood. The ones who had taught him hadn't forgotten. And now, they were listening. She looked down at the leaf again, pressed between 2 pages of her journal. "You brought me in," she whispered. She didn't know what lay beyond that gift, but she knew what it meant. And outside, in the silence just before frost, something old moved through the trees, watching not with fear, but with memory. and the forest, in its own slow way, remembered her back. By late October, the air had a bite to it. Not cruel, just honest. The kind that woke the skin and reminded bones they were aging. Mornings came in gold and gray. The mist hovered low over the earth, curling through the grass like it was searching for something it had left behind. The maples were fire-colored now. The birch leaves fell like coins, and Barnaby had changed. He wasn't restless. He was waiting. But for what? Marion couldn't say. He slept lighter, walked slower. At night, he stood for long stretches by the edge of the porch, gazing into the trees like he was listening for a song only he could hear. And he started building things again, patterns with stones and sticks, little mounds of pine cones placed in spirals. At first, she thought it was just a habit, but then she recognized the shapes. They were messages, signals. Around the edge of the cabin, they multiplied. Some half-buried, some tucked just beneath the woodpile or under her porch steps. Quiet warnings. Markers. One morning, she found a pattern pressed into the dirt right outside her door. Circles inside circles, lines pointing inward. He was calling out to someone, or maybe waiting for someone to arrive. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. The silence around him was answer enough. Then came the girl. It was just past 4 in the afternoon when Marion heard the giggle, a clear bird-like sound cutting through the usual quiet. She was on the side of the cabin, splitting kindling. She froze. The giggle came again, closer, and then a voice. Young, curious, barely above a whisper. "Are you a baby bear?" Marion rounded the corner fast enough to pull something in her hip. Standing at the edge of the clearing, no more than 8 feet from Barnaby, was a girl, maybe 8 years old. Brown braids, pink jacket, mismatched gloves. Her name came rushing back to Marion in a flood of neighborly memory. Lila Boone, Hazel's granddaughter, visited now and then. A sweet kid with too much curiosity and not enough supervision. Barnaby didn't move. He crouched low, arms loose at his sides, watching the girl like he wasn't sure whether to bolt or speak. Marion's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "Lila," she said, too sharply. "Honey, step back." The girl looked up, startled. "It's okay," she said. "He's nice. I saw him." "Lila, now." There was something in Marion's voice that even the trees paused for. Lila stepped back, eyes wide. Marion moved fast, placing herself between the two of them. Her heart pounded. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said, trying to sound gentle. "Where's your grandma?" Lila shrugged. "She's on the porch, talking on the phone. I came to look for frogs. He was watching me. I think he was trying to show me something." Marion crouched low, her voice lower now. "Lila, what you saw, it's not a bear, and it's not a pet. You mustn't follow him, understand?" The girl frowned. "But he didn't run. He just looked at me." Marion reached out and held her hand. "Promise me, sweet girl, don't follow into the woods. You could get lost. It's not safe." Lila nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on Barnaby's shape, half hidden in the brush. That night Marion sat with the weight of a new truth pressing into her ribs. She had lied, not to protect herself, but to protect something bigger than both of them. When Hazel asked, Marion just smiled tiredly and said a bear cub had wandered through. That's all. But the words felt thick. They stuck in her throat like they didn't belong to her. She hated lying to good people, especially people like Hazel. But some truths weren't hers to give away. The next day, Reed returned. Boots dusted with pine needles, face drawn. He didn't say hello, just handed her a folded sheet of paper. "Found more tracks," he said. "Bigger this time, much bigger." Marion opened the paper. A rubbing, wide foot, splayed toes, deep heel print. Not fresh, but not old either. "They're not wandering anymore," Reed said quietly. "They're moving with intention, grouped." I counted 5 sets. She looked up. Her heart knew what he was saying before he did. "They're coming closer," he said. "To here." That night Barnaby didn't eat. He sat on the porch, hands folded in his lap, facing the woods. He didn't glance at her once, just waited, motionless, like a child waiting for judgment. Marion brought out a blanket, set it gently beside him. He didn't move to touch it. She sat nearby, not speaking. The wind rustled the pines, but the forest stayed strangely quiet. No birds, no insects. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full, like breath before speech, or the hush before a verdict. She looked at him, this boy made of fur and silence and memory. And something inside her shifted. He wasn't just waiting, he was bracing. She knew that kind of stillness. It was the same one she had held when the doctors walked into the hospital room that spring so long ago. The stillness that said, "This isn't about what I want. It's about what I already know is coming." She reached for his hand. It was cold, and didn't pull away. She leaned in close. "You're not alone," she whispered. "Not tonight." But Barnaby's eyes stayed fixed on the dark line of the trees, and in them she saw something ancient and terrible and tender all at once. He was getting ready to leave. He just didn't know how. It began with a sound too deep for the human ear to truly hold. Not thunder, not wind, not the echo of a fallen tree. It came from beneath everything, beneath soil, stone, and silence. A tone so low it stirred the glass on the mantel. So old it felt like the mountain itself had remembered how to speak. Marion was chopping carrots when the windows shivered. She didn't drop the knife. She froze. The kind of stillness that comes when the ground itself tells you something is coming. Barnaby had been pacing since sundown. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't touched the folded blanket she'd set by the hearth. Just walked the same pattern along the wall, past the window, then back again. Over and over, like his feet remembered a path he hadn't taken in years. The cabin groaned under its own breath. And then, in the next second, the oil lamp near the door flickered, once, twice, before the flame guttered sideways as if pulled by something unseen. The sound came again, not loud, just present. Barnaby bolted, not out the door, but back, away. He slipped behind Marion, crouched low. His shoulders trembled, breath fast and sharp through clenched teeth. She stepped in front of him without thinking. Just did it. As natural as pulling your child behind you when headlights come too fast. But what was out there wasn't headlights. The forest outside didn't move. Not a single branch stirred. No crickets, no owls. Even the mist had frozen where it hovered. Then a shadow moved. She didn't see it at first. She felt it. Like the cabin leaned slightly. Not in danger, but in deference. Something was approaching. Something that belonged here far longer than any cabin or woman or road ever had. The edge of the clearing darkened. And through the pine line stepped something enormous. Nearly 9 feet tall. Covered in thick, deep brown fur that shimmered with sap and frost and dusted pine. It didn't stomp. It didn't growl. It arrived, like a storm that didn't need thunder to declare itself. Marion didn't back away. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, but she held her ground. The eyes were the first thing she truly saw. Big, liquid dark, wide set beneath a heavy brow, but not dull, not blank, sad. A sadness older than language. The creature stood still, not threatening, not passive, just monumental. And beside it, half a step behind, came another figure. Taller still. Shoulders like stone. The air around him colder. His fur darker. His chest broader. A face more angular. Less soft. Guardian. The word came uninvited. Not a name, a role, a weight. His eyes scanned the cabin like he was measuring its walls, its weaknesses. Barnaby whimpered behind her. Marion turned slightly. He didn't try to hide. Just stayed behind her, one hand clutching the edge of her sweater. Then the taller figure stepped forward. One deliberate step. Marion tensed. But the other, Mother, raised her hand. A short, subtle movement. Barely more than a twitch of fingers, and Guardian stopped. Marion watched the exchange. No words, just the crackle of energy between them. She didn't need to understand the language to know what just happened. No violence. Not tonight. Mother stepped forward. Slowly. Her massive feet soundless on the pine needle ground. She looked not at Marion, but at Barnaby, and Marion understood. Barnaby had run, not from danger, but from expectation. The rituals, the roles, the pressure to become something before he was ready. He had run, not in rebellion, but in fear. And now, the ones who had sent him into that world had come to take him back. Marion's hand trembled at her side. She didn't raise it. She didn't speak. But inside, she was screaming. Barnaby pressed closer behind her. His little body shivered with a different kind of fear now. Not primal, not animal. Emotional. The fear of leaving, the fear of losing. His hand reached for hers, found it, gripped it tight. Mother saw. She stepped closer, still slow, still reverent. And then stopped just short of the porch. Her eyes, those sorrowful, immense eyes, finally met Marion's, and they held. For a second, longer. Then, in a motion that felt almost too human, she placed her own hand on her chest. Open palm, firm, centered over the heart. A message. Not a command, not a demand. A statement. We come in respect. Guardian stayed still, his eyes never leaving Barnaby. But the tension in his frame shifted. The kind of shift that meant compromise. Or maybe surrender. Marion swallowed. Her knees ached. Her throat burned. She wanted to shout, to argue, to bargain. But she knew Barnaby didn't belong to her. Not really. He had found her. But he had not come for her. He had fled, and they were his. She looked down at him. He was staring at his mother now. His face unreadable, but his grip on her hand hadn't loosened. The choice wasn't Marion's. It was his. And yet, she felt like the world was being split in two. Barnaby looked up at her. His lips didn't move, but his eyes did. Please! And Marion understood. He wasn't asking to stay forever. He was asking to be seen, to be acknowledged as both, of the forest and of her. She dropped to one knee, brought their hands to her chest, then let go. Barnaby stood still for a moment, then took one step forward. Mother dropped to a squat, massive knees bent, arms open, not to grab, not to claim, to wait. Barnaby stopped halfway, turned, and looked at Marion one last time. His chest heaved. Then he placed his hand over his own heart, held it. One beat, two, then turned back. He stepped into the clearing. Mother wrapped her arms around him, slow and sure. Not in triumph, but in relief. And Guardian? Guardian bowed his head. Not to Marion, to Barnaby. And the boy, the child of two worlds, was silent. But the forest heard him speak, because in that moment, every tree leaned in, and the night exhaled. But the ache in Marion's chest stayed. Not because he left, but because he'd almost stayed. And love, real love, let's go. The night didn't end. It softened, turned into something quieter, heavier, like the weight of a goodbye settling into the bones before the mouth has the courage to say the words. The forest didn't move. Neither did Marion. She stood on the porch, her hand still resting on the spot where Barnaby had last held her, as if his touch had left behind a shape the air refused to erase. The fire inside had gone low, but she didn't light more wood. Let it die. Let the house breathe in the silence he left behind. Barnaby hadn't run. He hadn't clung or cried. But when he turned to go, when his small frame melted into the arms of that towering mother beneath the pines, something inside Marion cracked in the most invisible place. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture in the part of her that had remembered how to feel safe again. But morning always comes, whether you want it or not. The sun rose pale and still over the ridge, dusting the frost in gold. Marion didn't sleep. She sat in her chair through the night, holding the old wool blanket she'd once wrapped around him. It still smelled of damp fur and wood smoke. She didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because the kind of grief she carried was too familiar to spill that easy. And when she heard the soft tread outside just before first light, she knew. She opened the door before they could knock. Mother stood a few paces from the porch, massive but calm. The guardian remained deeper in the trees, more shadow than shape. Neither spoke, neither moved. But in the space between them and her, the air vibrated with something ancient, something solemn. Barnaby stepped forward slowly. She hadn't expected that. He walked carefully across the frost, each step deliberate, as if learning to carry weight again. His fur was brushed, his face cleaner. There was something different in the way he moved. He wasn't hiding anymore. He didn't run into her arms. He didn't have to. He stopped just in front of her and looked up. Marion knelt down. There was no sound, but the wind moving softly through the trees, like it didn't want to interrupt. Barnaby took her hand, and without a word, he pressed his forehead gently to her chest. Her arms wrapped around him, once, tightly. He was still shaking, not from fear, from knowing this was the last time. And she whispered, barely moving her lips, "I'm so proud of you." Then he stepped back, just one step, and behind him, Mother moved forward. Not to separate them, not to claim, but to honor the space between. And then, she did something Marion couldn't have prepared for. She bowed. Not a gesture of dominance. Not the stiff, formal motion of an animal showing submission. She bowed her head. To Marion. Held it there for a moment. In that silence, the trees leaned in, and Marion's breath caught. She felt it, bone deep. This wasn't performance. This wasn't for show. It was the highest gesture of respect the creature had to give, and it shattered something soft inside her. When the guardian approached next, her muscles tensed out of habit. His presence still felt heavier, colder. But he didn't tower. He stopped at the porch step. In his hand, wrapped in layers of woven reed and soft moss, was a small object. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a piece of old wood, dark from time, carved with delicate grooves spiraling across its surface. Not polished, not decorative, sacred. He held it out with both hands, and Marion understood. This was not just a gift. This was recognition, a place, a role. She accepted it without a word. And for a long beat, the guardian's eyes rested on hers, not with fondness, with trust. The ritual was complete. The moment didn't ask for anything more. But just as they turned, just as Barnaby began to follow his kin back toward the edge of the clearing, something in Marion shifted. She stepped forward, her mouth opened, and for the briefest second, she wanted to say it. Stay. Her hand gripped the wood tighter. She could call him back, could close the door, could wrap that little body in blankets and never let the world take him again. But then she looked up and met Mother's eyes, and in those eyes saw the same pain mirrored. The pain of one who had already lost something once. The ache of reclaiming your child, not as they were, but as they are now. Changed, older, with pieces belonging to another world. And Marion knew. You don't steal someone's child because you miss the silence. You love them enough to let them go. So she let the urge pass, let it die inside her chest without fanfare. And when Barnaby turned back, just once, at the edge of the woods, she was smiling. He raised his hand, not in goodbye, in blessing. Then he reached forward, toward Mother, and she, without hesitation, bent down, guided his small hand toward her, and allowed him one last touch. He pressed his cheek to Marion's, gently. Their skin met in the cold air, and for a second, neither moved. A gesture of reverence, of finality. And then he was gone, folded into the mist, taken not by force, not by obligation, but by belonging. Marion stood alone at the edge of the clearing, the carved wood still in her hand. She didn't move for a long time, didn't breathe deeply until the wind shifted, didn't cry until the mist had swallowed the last of their shadows. She walked back inside. The fire had gone cold. She didn't relight it. She wrapped the carved gift in one of Jack's old handkerchiefs and placed it on the mantel beside the picture of her son. Then she sat on the floor, beneath the window, let her head fall back, and whispered to the empty room. He wasn't mine to keep. And somewhere deep in the forest, beyond sight, beyond hearing, a mother of another kind held her son close and felt the weight of gratitude from a woman she would never speak to, but who had given her back the one thing no wild place could ever return. A chance to hold her child without fear. And Marion, with the ache still warm in her chest, knew something else too. He hadn't just learned from her. He had brought something back to them. Something better. Snow had arrived gently, like someone slipping back into a house they once called home. No gusts, no warning, just a slow hush over the earth, softening every outline, every branch, every stone. Marion Tate stood at the window, watching the forest wrap itself in quiet. The cabin was warm, not from the fire. It had gone low again, but from the weight of memory. It filled the corners like light in the morning, the kind you don't need to chase because you know it will find you anyway. Her breath fogged the glass just slightly as she leaned forward. She traced one fingertip along the condensation, drawing nothing, just moving to feel something. Barnaby had been gone for weeks, long enough for the routine to return, almost. She still boiled water in the dented kettle he once watched with those wide, solemn eyes. Still cut apple slices into quarters, even though she didn't eat them all. Still paused before stepping out onto the porch, just in case there were new prints, small and familiar, pressed into the frost. There never were, not at first. Then, one morning, there was something different. She didn't notice it until she reached for the firewood. Lying just beside the woodpile, neatly, deliberately, was a feather. Not from a bird she recognized. Long, silky, almost translucent. The kind of thing no storm could have dropped by chance. She picked it up gently, turned it in her fingers. It was soft, warmer than it should have been for something resting in snow, and it was clean, as if it had been carried here in care. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back and scanned the tree line. Nothing, just the woods, still, watching, as it always had. She didn't call out. She just stood there, the feather held close, and whispered into the air between snowflakes. "Thank you." The forest said nothing, but something in it seemed to listen. Days passed, maybe weeks. She stopped counting them. Started trusting the light again, the way it came through the window in soft slants, landing on the old pine floor where Barnaby used to sit, curled beside the hearth. One morning, Reed Dawson showed up again, his cheeks red from the cold, boots caked in packed snow. He didn't knock, just tapped gently and waited. Marion opened the door, and before he could say a word, she saw it in his eyes. He'd seen something. He nodded slowly, took off his gloves. "I was near the edge of the old Boone property," he said, "by the ravine. Saw movement across the hill. First I thought it was a moose, big, heavy gait." He paused, his voice dropped. "But it wasn't a moose." She didn't speak, just waited. He swallowed. It stopped just at the tree line. Tall, maybe taller than anything I've seen up there before, broad shoulders, and the eyes. He looked at her. They weren't scared, just watching. He hesitated, then added, "It wasn't the same one." Marion's breath caught. Reed nodded. This one was different, older, but something about it. The way it moved. There was a calmness to it. She knew, instinctively. Mother. Still watching, still near, not to threaten, to remember. Reed sipped coffee from the mug she gave him, quiet for a while, then said, "Do you think they keep track of us?" Marion looked toward the trees. "I think they remember who kept them safe," she said, "and who didn't." That evening she stood by the hearth, adding a few logs to the fire, when a sound came from outside. Not a knock, not footsteps, just a soft, dry rustle, like something brushing against the porch wood. She opened the door. Snow was falling again, soft as ash, and on the top step sat a figure, small, covered in fur. Its back to her. Still, she froze. The shape turned. It wasn't Barnaby. The eyes were younger, lighter in color, the features softer, less defined. It didn't run, just stared. And then behind it, between the trees, a movement. Not one, but two. The first massive, calm. The second, taller now, broader in the shoulders. With eyes she knew better than her own reflection. Barnaby. He didn't step forward. Didn't need to. She did. She came to the porch edge, heart hammering. He stood farther than she wanted, but close enough that she could see him clearly now. His posture had changed. He was taller, not by much, but enough to make her breath shake. His fur was cleaner, deeper in tone, and his face. Still his. Still the same gentle intelligence. He raised a hand, placed it over his heart, then bowed his head, slow, deliberate. She couldn't move for a moment. Then her hand followed suit. The small figure at her feet, perhaps a sibling, perhaps another like him, didn't flinch as she knelt. It just watched her, wide-eyed, alert. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a scrap of cloth, one she'd kept tucked away. Barnaby's old towel, worn thin at the edges, folded for years now into a square. She set it gently beside the new child. Didn't speak. Didn't reach. Let them choose. The child leaned forward, sniffed, touched it with one small finger, then looked back toward the trees. Barnaby nodded once. It turned again and sat quietly, waiting. Marion looked up. Barnaby had already stepped back, disappearing again slowly, but not leaving. Not forever. He paused once more near the tree line, and then, with one last glance, faded into the white. She stood there for a long while. The young one settled beside the door, curled up into the towel. Snow thickened on the roof. Inside, the fire warmed the walls. And something in Marion's chest, something old and weathered and sore, healed just a little more. She sat down in her rocker, the firelight flickering against the photograph of her son on the mantel. And beside it, the carved piece of wood from the forest. A sign, a promise, not of return, but of remembrance. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees, carrying nothing and everything. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and whispered more to herself than anyone. A forest child knocked on my door once, and from that night on, my heart never closed again. And the forest, like a friend just out of view, kept its vow. It never forgot her. Sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that change us the most. Not because they shout or chase or try to prove anything, but because they stay with us, like the echo of a kind gesture, like the hush after someone closes a door softly so it doesn't wake the house. This wasn't a story about monsters or myths or things that belong in books. It was a story about what happens when the walls we build around our hearts begin to crack, and something unexpected steps inside, not to harm, not to haunt, but to remind us we're still capable of connection. There are places in this world, deep in the forests, quiet in the corners of our lives, where wonder still lives, where the rules are different, where survival doesn't mean shutting down, but opening up. And in those places, the boundaries we think we need, between wild and tame, between grief and healing, between them and us, begin to blur. Sometimes, all it takes is a knock, soft, unassuming, low to the ground and barely heard. But if we have the courage to answer, if we open the door even a little, we might find that what we fear isn't what's waiting outside. It's what we've forgotten how to feel on the inside. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wrapped in fur, or memory, or forgiveness. And no matter how many winters pass, no matter how deep the snow or long the night, the forest remembers kindness. It remembers warmth. It remembers who made space for something different, something sacred. This wasn't just about a cabin, or a storm, or the strange meeting of two worlds. This was about how love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and family doesn't always arrive through bloodlines or names. Sometimes it walks out of the dark with trembling hands. Sometimes it leaves gifts instead of words. And sometimes it returns, changed but not gone. In the end, maybe that's what we're all waiting for. Not proof, not answers, but to be remembered, to be seen, to know that somewhere, in the quiet corners of the earth or in the soul of another, we left something good behind. So if you've ever felt alone, if you've ever kept the fire burning just in case, if your heart has ever ached for something you couldn't name, then maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't fiction. Maybe it was a reflection of the better parts of us. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey, for sitting with the silence, for listening between the words. We'd love to hear what it stirred in you. Please leave a comment with your thoughts, your memories, or even just a moment that stayed with you. And if this story found a place in your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep telling stories like this. Stories that aren't afraid to be tender. Stories that believe in the beauty of being human. Until the next knock on the door, take care of your fire and keep the porch light on.